In this video, we conclude our discussion on Chapter 5, Part 2, where in our last video we developed a decision rule for consumer choice. In today's video, we will develop product demand by setting up some preliminaries to then derive product demand itself. Beginning with our preliminaries, in our last video we used our knowledge of consumers to explain their decision making through utility maximization. This led to developing the decision rule of the marginal rate of substitution equaling the price ratio, which meant that additional utility was equal to additional cost for each good considered, which meant that there was no incentive to consume more or less of any good as a result, given that the consumer is at the highest level of utility compatible with their budget constraint, which also meant that consumers are applying this decision rule at the rate of using all of their income as well. So then now we seek to use this decision rule in utility maximization to develop product demand, which recall is the ability and willingness to buy specific quantities of a good at alternative prices in a given time period, holding all else equal, or ceteris paribus. And to do so, we will work through our example and consider what happens to the consumer's decision if the price on a good changes. So, suppose we have our consumer going to the grocery store with some income for their post-workout meal of ground beef and brown rice as before. We know that their decision is based off of the marginal rate of substitution equaling the price ratio, where we have our utility maximization process on the right, quantity of brown rice is on the vertical, quantity of ground beef is on the horizontal. We have our downward sloping budget constraint in black representing all our possible choices, and we have our highest indifference curve compatible with this budget constraint representing a particular level of utility with indifference curve 0 in blue, and then we have our utility maximizing bundle where marginal rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio at point B, giving us our post-workout meal of a particular quantity of brown rice as well as ground beef. And in terms of product demand, we're going to be concerned initially with ground beef, so we'll have product demand below, where price is going to be on the vertical axis and quantity of ground beef is going to be on the horizontal axis. We have our initial point B, where B is going to be the quantity level of ground beef that is associated with the utility maximized bundle point B that we have above, and the price that the consumer is facing at the grocery store as well. So then with this in mind, the question that we have then is, suppose that the consumer goes to the grocery store and has observed that the price of ground beef has increased. What happens? Well, in terms of their available choices, with the price of ground beef increasing, that means they'll have fewer options available to them in terms of purchasing ground beef, and we can represent this with pivoting our budget constraint inward, where we go from budget constraint 0 to budget constraint 1 in purple, where we see that there's reduced options in terms of ground beef available to this consumer now. So then in terms of their decision-making process, they update their bundle, where given this new budget constraint, they find the new highest level of utility that's compatible with this budget constraint, which in this case is going to be indifference curve 1 with budget constraint 1 giving us point A, where at point A we have a new quantity level in terms of brown rice and ground beef for our post-workout meal, where we see that brown rice and ground beef has decreased in terms of this increase in price on ground beef. But since our sole interest is on ground beef at the moment, what this means in terms of product demand is price has increased, quantity has decreased, so then in terms of our product demand curve, this generates us point A on our product demand curve, where this reflects the price increase on ground beef and quantity has been reduced in terms of our decision of a post-workout meal. Now, let us consider the opposite case. We have our initial bundle, point B, and suppose now that the consumer goes to the grocery store and the price on ground beef has decreased, say due to a sale. Well, what this means in terms of their available choices, if ground beef is on sale, that means they can purchase greater quantities of ground beef than they could before. So then in terms of their budget constraint, since only one price is changing, we have a pivot outwards from budget constraint 0 to budget constraint 2 in purple, where we see there's a greater amount of ground beef that this consumer can now afford. So then in terms of their decision making, they update their decision and find the new level of utility that's highest and compatible with their budget constraint. So this is going to be indifference curve 2 in red, and intersecting our budget constraint 2 in purple once at point C, where we see that at point C brown rice has increased and ground beef has increased as compared to our initial bundle point B. And since our sole interest is in terms of ground beef, what this means in terms of capturing for product demand, ground beef is on sale, so price has decreased, and ground beef has increased. So then this is going to mean generating point C on our product demand curve, where C, in terms of point A, B, and C, we have generated a downward sloping product demand curve as a result of these price changes. So then what we overall saw then through our change in price for ground beef, the consumer updated their decision for a post-workout meal, which led to quantity of ground beef changing, implying a change in quantity demanded, that is, movement along the demand curve due to a change in the price of that good. But not only that, price and quantity demanded for ground beef moved inversely of one another, which demonstrated the law of demand. That is, the quantity of a good demanded in a given time period increases as its price falls, given no other changes. So then, we developed product demand through successive price changes as a result of this demonstration of the law of demand and changes in quantity demanded. So then, to further go through this process, let us repeat it now, but for brown rice. So we have our consumer as before, considering their post-workout meal, and they're going to be using all of their income at the rate of the margin rate of substitution equaling the price ratio. We have our utility maximization process on the right as before, giving us point B, our particular post-workout meal with the quantity level of brown rice, as well as ground beef. And in terms of product demand, now we're concerned with brown rice, so price is going to be on the vertical axis, quantity of brown rice is going to be on the horizontal axis, and now point B is going to be the price point associated with the price of brown rice on our budget constraint in our utility maximization process, and our quantity level of brown rice for point B is going to be the quantity level of brown rice that this consumer faces in terms of the post-workout meal that they selected. So then now let us pose the question of, what if the consumer goes to the grocery store and has observed that the price on brown rice has increased? Well, what that means in terms of their available choices, price has increased, so their available choices for brown rice will decrease, which we can represent with an inward pivot of the budget constraint, going from budget constraint 0 to budget constraint 1 in purple, where we see that there's fewer options available to them in terms of brown rice. So then with this new budget constraint, the consumer updates their decision-making process and finds the new highest level of utility compatible with this budget constraint. So this is going to be at indifference curve 1 in red, intersecting our budget constraint 1 in purple solely once, giving us point A, giving us a new quantity in terms of brown rice and ground beef for this post-workout meal, where both brown rice and ground beef has decreased. But since our sole interest is in terms of brown rice, what this means in terms of product demand, price has increased and brown rice has decreased. So then this will generate point A on our product demand curve. Price of brown rice has increased, quantity in terms of brown rice has decreased. Then now let us pose the opposite case. Suppose we have our original utility maximized bundle, point B, but then the consumer goes to the grocery store and observes that brown rice is now on sale. With brown rice now being on sale, that means the price has decreased. With a decrease in price, with the same amount of income, they now have a greater amount of options available to them in terms of purchasing brown rice. We can represent this in terms of the budget constraint by shifting it outwards from budget constraint 0 to budget constraint 2 in purple. We see that there's a greater amount of options available to them in terms of brown rice. And with this new budget constraint, the consumer then updates their decision by finding the new highest level utility compatible with their budget constraint, which is going to be on indifference curve 2 in red, intersecting budget constraint 2 in purple solely once, which is going to occur at point C, where we see that at point C, brown rice has increased and ground beef has slightly increased as well compared to our initial bundle B. And since our sole interest is in terms of brown rice in this case, with a decrease in the price of brown rice due to a sale and brown rice being increased as a result, this then generates point C in terms of product demand, where once again, through successive price changes and quantity demand responded, we have generated a downward sloping product demand curve, where in this case it's for brown rice. So just as we saw with ground beef, but now in regard to brown rice, the consumer updated their decision for a post-workout meal, quantity of brown rice changed, implying a change of quantity demanded occurred. Additionally, price and quantity demanded for brown rice moved inversely with one another, which demonstrated the law of demand. And through these successive changes, we derived product demand for brown rice as a result. So then, overall what we have then is, given our framework for consumer choice, we have seen that product demand is the result of consumer updates to their utility maximization process due to price changes, in that the consumer has initial available choices, that is their ability, and they have preferences as well, which will represent their willingness. They use all of their income to consume at the rate of the marginal rate of substitution, equaling the price ratio, and should the price on a good change, then their available choices will change, which then means that affects their ability. So then new consumption is found where all income is used at the marginal rate of substitution equaling the price ratio, which shows that quantity demanded is responding to price changes, and that these responses are inversely related to one another, giving us the law of demand. And through going through multiple iterations of this process, this generates us a product demand curve.